I have lived in Casper, Wyoming for my entire life. Every weekend that I was able, I would choose to shake off the stress of a long work week with a nature hike. Hiking is the one thing that I feel connected me to the universe outside of my glorious job at Walmart. 2 years strong. Hold the applause. The week before this incident happened, I had a fairly awful Friday getting reamed out by my manager and needed to get out to avoid losing it. I decided that I would hike up a ridge near Garden Creek to relax, and decided to photograph the sun sinking red on the horizon. In the process of taking the picture of the sunset, I dropped my phone trying to get the perfect angle. It cascaded down over the ledge some 20-odd feet below. Cursing, I descended the rocks, praying that the phone had sustained minimal damage, and located it after detecting the sun's reflection off the screen. To my relief, it was undamaged aside from a small ding, when I noticed a rusted square of metal set into the ground about 4 square feet in size. I approached the metal plate and handle. It was just outside of view from the beaten path, and I realized that this was a trapdoor that was intentionally designed to be discreet. I did what any guy with nothing particularly exciting going on in his life would do, and lifted the hatch, revealing a set of rungs that descended into blackness. With close to no hesitation, I took in a deep breath, gripped the metal bars, and began to follow them down into the abyss. As I held my LED flashlight strapped between my teeth, my first thought was that it had to be some kind of fallout shelter. There had been no label upon the latchway for where the ladder would lead me, but I reasoned that someone may have stolen the sign at some point, since post-apocalyptic displays had come back into style. The echoes in the darkness were spread out, and I soon realized that the chamber that I was entering was absolutely massive. Eventually, after 20 meters of descending that ladder, I located the ground and shined the circular beam of the flashlight around in absolute amazement. It was an immense facility, seemingly unused for decades, from the telltale orange, red, and brown pattern of the rug that looked like something straight out of the late 70's. The gaudy green desks confirmed this, upon which sat TRS-80 Model 2 computers with their large floppy disk drives and coffee mugs with copper fonts with phrases like "Disco is dead," and cassettes of Rush with other gems from around 40 years ago. It was a time warp, and I was ecstatic to have discovered the place, albeit a bit creeped out by the dark, cavernous space, lit solely by the cold beam of my flashlight. There was paperwork stacked neatly and in and out trays, rotary phones, and even a few beanbag chairs near the wood-paneled walls. I walked through the enormous circular space, noticing double doors on the wall, and continued through them, my eyes wide in astonishment. Past those doors was the longest hallway I had ever seen. I could just make out the end. The light of my flashlight was barely able to penetrate the thick subterranean darkness. There appeared to be over 100 tall steel doors lining the corridor, each locked and containing a small slot for perhaps food or outside observation. A shiver climbed up my spine as I stared at the heavy locks on the doors, and it was then that I caught the faint scent of decay. I raised the beam to the slit and peeked into the first chamber on the left. Upon peering in, my neck hairs raised in fear at what I was seeing. A thin, naked man was standing there, facing away from the sliver of the door. He was unmoving. His skin looked almost glossy, reflecting the light in an eerie glow. At first, I assumed him to be long dead, somehow frozen in place, but his hairless head twitched slightly, as if disturbed by my light. I then fell backwards in shock, covering my mouth with my hand. My mind raced in an attempt to comprehend what I had just seen, and questions exploded endlessly across my mind. I then saw a slip of yellowed, brittle paper glued to the door that read 01AR. I then noticed that all the other doors were numbered as well. I peeked in another window and saw a long, empty chamber with what looked like a moving, oily substance slowly climbing up the walls. I blinked in disbelief. It was like liquid moving against the push of gravity. I actually bit my hand to assure myself that I wasn't dreaming, feeling the pain swell in confirmation. I peered through another window and shouted as a horrific spiral of teeth slammed against the plexiglass slit. I stared in revulsion and disbelief. Whatever the thing in there was had to be over 2 feet in diameter. Its dozens of sharp teeth twirling against the plexiglass. My mind began to spin as I noticed one of the chambers further in looked to be missing a door. That's when I realized it was actually wide open. It was then that I heard a slam echoing from the large chamber where the entrance hatch was located. Something was coming down the ladder with the echoing clicks of the steel rungs. I ran down the hall past the ungodly nightmares locked behind the steel doors. The beam of my flashlight illuminated horrible things in those window slits. Teeth, fangs, claws, stretched limbs, and bubbling forms. Things that could not exist. Things that dug into the part of my brain that controlled logic and rational thought, ripping it to shreds with clawed fingers as I ran down that endless hall. The smell of death grew stronger as I passed through the doorway that led into the massive chamber filled with corpses in various states of decay. Some mummified, black and skeletal, others fresh and red, some bloated and white with putrefaction. I coughed bile, and finally came to another set of doors and burst through. Cabinets and lockers, giant reels of magnetic tape lined on the foxwood paneling on the walls. It seemed to be some sort of archive, and I noticed a desk large enough to hide under. I dove underneath it, clutching at my knees. Whoever or whatever was now in the hallway was getting closer, and I was praying that I could muffle the frantic sound of my breathing by the time the thing arrived. Staggered steps approached, each accompanied by a loud dragging sound. I sat under the desk in the murky darkness, breathing as slowly and quietly as my panicked body would allow. My clenched hands on my knees tightened as the sharp metal bang from the door being pushed forward rang out. The dragging sound approached in my direction, no longer accompanied by steps due to the carpeting. The sound grew closer and closer to me, and I braced myself when a heavy slam rang out directly in front of me. A few seconds later, the double doors clanked again, and I heard some footsteps in the hall. Whatever had entered had left discreetly, and just as I was deliberating crawling out from beneath the desk and making a run for it, my phone vibrated. As I removed my phone to quickly silence it, the dim light of my phone screen illuminated the space under the desk and the horrific gaunt face staring in at me. And I was about to scream at the thing before realizing the face wasn't mutated. It was just upside down. Something had dragged a man's corpse in here and slammed him down on the desk directly across from mine on his back, so his head was hanging in my line of sight. I caught my breath, realizing that whoever had brought the body here was likely returning soon. I used the small circular beam to scan the room, then grabbed a few handfuls of papers from random cabinets and drawers. There were 8-track players and cassettes, reel-to-reel tape loops, and other storage devices that had existed in that era. I couldn't find anything that was more modern. I slowly snuck past the desks and lockers, past the paintings of gray-haired men in polyester suits, and towards the 2 double doors on the opposite end of the room. The realization that there may be another exit brought the optimistic concept of escape back into my mind, and I made my way over in silent, cautious steps. I clenched my jaw as I opened the other set of doors as quietly as possible. Another hallway of roughly 100 doors stretched down the dark length of the passage. It was as if the entire space was mirrored. This facility was absolutely gargantuan. I looked down the long hall of heavy steel doors, knowing that nightmarish things likely were inside of each of these chambers. I took a moment to shine the light on the papers that I had salvaged from the archives, and I read, slack-jawed in both amazement and confusion. The papers I held seemed to be internal communications of whatever organization this had once been. I scanned over references to thermal and ionizing radiation, an experimentation seemingly to prevent lethal radiation poisoning. I flipped through the pages, reading about the threats, but nobody mentioned what the threat was except on one page, where the threat was referred to more specifically by name: USSR. This massive facility was a relic from the Cold War. Only one document had a company title, a little logo of 3 blocky letters under which was written Anti-Radiation Kinetics. I stood in the dark hall, the beam of light barely illuminating the space, intrigue leading me over to the first chamber on the left. Unable to stop myself, I lifted the light to the plexiglass slit and peered in. Inside was a thin, naked woman with wet skin. It was glossy, just like the man I saw in the first cell I peered into. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the metal doors push open in the previous room. Whatever had taken that corpse was now heading in my direction, with the sound of the dragging body getting louder and closer. I removed my hiking boots to soften the sound of my steps, slinging them over my shoulder as I ran down that hallway in my socks, catching glimpses of more horrific faces and forms. Something gray and veiny, with 4 large black orbs of spider eyes stared at me, twitching. Another door's window showed a thin figure with a hairless, wrinkled head that was one giant mouth similar to a canine's. The stench of death built as I realized that this hallway had another open cell, one that I started to realize was a food storage unit for feeding the abominations in this forgotten place. I knew that I had no desire to meet whoever was feeding them, so I quickly passed that room, noticing human limbs hacked and piled away from the rotting dead. I then tried to exit as quietly as possible through the doors at the end. I pushed, but they didn't budge. I pushed again, my heart pounding in my chest up to my throat as I realized in absolute horror. These doors were locked. I turned and ran into the awful stench of the room, realizing that I was completely trapped. I scanned my surroundings and quickly found a pile of pasty corpses and jumped behind the bruised and bloody stack. I pressed my face hard into one of my hiking boots to filter the rancid stink that was beyond anything I could imagine. I turned my phone off, and I awaited whoever was approaching the meat locker I was now trapped in. The sound of meat and bone chopping filled my ears in the large pitch-black chamber. Snapping, sawing, and splashing, accompanied by the smell of death as I laid hidden in silence. The footsteps came and went, delivering the cuts of meat to each of the cells. Whoever, or whatever was feeding those things, either memorized every inch of this place, or could somehow see in the facility, which was entirely devoid of light. I waited for what must have been a few hours before there was a good 10 minutes of silence. I breathed deeply, mustered my courage, and illuminated the grisly chamber with my flashlight. I walked through the puddles of blood across the floor from the butchered bodies, and was disgusted at myself for realizing, despite the horrific odor of death I had been breathing in, I hadn't eaten anything in a very long time. I needed food and water soon, or I would lose my strength. Whatever was bringing in fresh kills down here went back the other way. I grabbed a set of keys hanging beside the open doorway, and then headed back to the locked double doors on the other side of the room, flashlight in my teeth and boots strung over my shoulders, trying one key after another for what seemed like an eternity, with absolutely no luck. Frustration spilled from a deepening well of despair, until I finally felt a key enter the door's lock fully, and exhaled in relief as it turned. I shined the beam forward, amazed by the sight before me. Giant vats, large cylinders of compressed gases, and glass containers were lined in dozens of rows that stretched out as far as a football field. Wide metallic tanks lined the walls, reflecting the beam of my small flashlight. They were large chambers, maybe 6 meters in diameter, each of them containing a door. Scattered black splashes of ancient blood, long since dried, speckled the cement floors, and loose paperwork on the desks which divided the rows of tanks told a tale of chaos. I shined my narrow beam to read the paperwork as best as I could, and blinked in frozen shock at what I saw. There were countless tests of blood pressure, heart rates, and radiation level monitoring, as well as packets containing the names of couples, and others naming full families. I flipped through a packet labeled 10-AR/11-AR, corresponding with the labels on the locked doors. I read in disbelief as the promotional packet slid out, decorated with eggshell blue, orange, and brown squares, and an illustration of a smiling family, which again looked like something straight out of the 70's. It was titled ARC Anti-Radiation Kinetics and You. The informational brochure blew my mind. This appeared to be a service for volunteers, or more likely paying families, to subjugate themselves to a battery of experiments for the purpose of living through an impending nuclear winter. There was a colored pencil illustration of a child, with blonde pigtails and a pink bell dress, hugging a cat with the caption, "Sally's cat Tammy is her best friend. That's because Tammy has life-saving genes that can help Sally." I turned the pages in complete disbelief, not only that this whole process was actually conceived, but in some horrific manner, possibly even achieved. A similar illustration showed an older man smoking a pipe, smiling while holding a test tube. The caption underneath him read, "Tom chose an entirely new protein our top scientists created to take him beyond immunity, possibly extending his life by decades." The pamphlet ended showing an illustration of a family smiling, sitting in metal tanks that resembled those that were lining the massive chamber walls. Nothing I saw showed those things in the chambers. I scrambled through other notes and urgent memos when describing rapid, uncontrollable, extreme, and seemingly random mutations. I looked at the memo's title, reading, "What went wrong?" I gazed in awe at the massive facility, the ARC Lab, and all of its horrific glory, ushering only a lucky few to the future to repopulate the world, anticipating an event that never happened, at least, not yet. I kept walking, taking it all in. The small circular beam of my flashlight was barely able to reach the walls. Those metal cylinders was where those couples and families began the nightmarish transformation into what now sat in those cells. I kept walking, hunger pangs kicking at me, as I saw a desk on which sat a bowl of ancient hard candies. I ran over and ate the entire, stale clump, nearly chipping my tooth. I then continued past desks of gyroscopes, blood centrifuges, monitoring equipment, and the likes. I froze upon hearing keys jiggling, and I heard the door behind me open. I heard footsteps slap on the floor in pursuit as I ran, despite having no idea where I was running to. I was trapped, likely about to die. I would end up in that discarded pile of human meat in the other room. I made it to the other side of the giant chamber, and to another door made of wood, with a knob and chipped screwed holes. My pursuer was nearly upon me as I tried the door. Twisting the knob and pushing it open with all my might, I slipped in through the crack and slammed the door behind me, scrambling until I found the lock. Pounding then shook the door as I sank low to the ground. I shined the flashlight around to find myself in a fairly well-decorated lobby. It was quaint and ornamented, with rounded furniture with pegged legs in the usually quirky colors of the 70's, though appearing far more sinister by that single beam of my flashlight. I saw more pamphlets and plastic holders on a desk, and finally realized this was where the journey began. Most importantly, I saw the glowing orange ring on the elevator's doorframe. The wooden door that I entered from was clearly not going to hold whatever had discovered my presence for long, so I ran to the elevator, mashing the glowing button. I hadn't even considered the fact that this facility had power. I entered the dim yellow light of the elevator, hearing music and a jingling of keys from outside the door. A fuzzy jazz flute-heavy elevator music played on speakers as my pursuer entered through the wooden lobby door with wide eyes, reaching out to me with open hands. A normal-looking man aside from his milky white eyes, perhaps in his mid-60s, ran into the room screaming just as the doors began to close. I slammed the button and watched the door shut in the nick of time. I breathed deeply and slid to the floor, and then sat to put my hiking boots back on. I was exhausted. I finally registered his muffled voice and what he was screaming. "They're loose down there!" The elevator was moving, but it was not moving up. It was moving down. An instrumental version of a 1970s song I vaguely recognized fuzz from the speaker in the elevator as it made its descent. I climbed up on the handrail and tried to open the locked ceiling hatch, shaking it and hitting the lock in vain. There soon came a muffled sniffing, then a scratching from the hatch, then a creak of metal bending. What appeared to be long malformed teeth punctured the metal plating of the hatch and began prying it open. I rushed to the front of the elevator car and pounded the open door button as sweat beaded on my forehead. The music crackled before squealing with a deafening screech of feedback. The noise stopped the thing from prying open the metal hatch, and it wailed before it retreated. My palms squeezed over my ears, and I slid to the floor until the sound stopped, and a staticky voice spoke to me over the outdated speaker system. "You are in very serious danger." I looked up to see long fingers, like articulated drumsticks, emerge from the shadow. I watched helplessly as they reached through the opening in the hatch and returned to trying to pry it open. I yelled for help, asking the stranger to make the noise that seemed to repel the thing. But it was clear the speaker was only one way. There was no phone or any kind of intercom device, just open, close, and the 2 floors. I was attempting to figure out how to make a last-ditch makeshift weapon when the elevator stopped and the doors slid open. I looked out in utter confusion, trying to understand what I was looking at. There was a road separating 2 rows of housing that extended into the space under an eerie domed ceiling that was painted like a lit sky. More rows of housing units and streets continued to my right. It was like an overly exaggerated nuclear family suburb with actual white picket fences and astroturf lawns. All the small houses were Easter egg colors, throwback ranch homes from a different era. I walked out of the elevator, feeling the bounce of the black rubber street beneath my boots, and I hurried to the first house, peering into the windows. It was dimly lit, but appeared to be vacant. I then rushed in the door, which was thankfully unlocked. As soon as I twisted the knob, I heard the metal clang of that thing from the elevator roof landing on the floor of the car. I kept as quiet as possible as the long, horrid shadow of the thing walked by the window to my side. My back was to the door, and I stared at the overlapping colored ovals of the wallpaper that opened to a small kitchen. I then noticed a mirror on the wall that revealed a view of the outside window behind me, and I finally saw that thing from the elevator. It was horrific, tall, and bony, with multiple rows of elongated human teeth spilling out over each other from a massive gummy mouth under wide, white eyes. The nose was a small bump above 2 black slits on its jagged face. I realized that if I could see it, it could see me. I stayed as still and as silent as possible when a squeal rang out from a speaker system, scaring the thing away, and it ran deeper into the makeshift town. The voice crackled on the speaker as the stranger spoke again. "If you're alive, you need to listen closely. The area that you're in was built to house our clients in case the anti-radiation treatment went wrong, which it did. I am the only one left maintaining this place, but I'm close to making it right again. I'm sure of it this time. I realized that he must be insane if he thought he could fix anything about this zoo of nightmares. I crept on the olive green carpet towards the kitchen as silently as possible. I was getting further from the door, but I could still hear him over the speakers of the enormous fallout shelter. I looked out the kitchen window that was fixed to the massive outer chamber wall. It was a cutout display that emulated depth, with a layered set of photos of rolling hills and trees. I shook my head and reached down to open the kitchen drawers, removing the steak knife that I found inside. Use the maintenance hatch labeled A13, just a bit forward to the left, the voice said gravely. I gripped the knife and slowly walked to the window looking out to the street. Seeing some emaciated form climb out of the window of one of the houses, it walked on 4 pale branches of fleshy limbs that twisted and curled like ram horns. Its skin was pocked with patches of sprouting bluish worms that waved slowly as it moved. Its narrow head was inhuman and deformed, squeezed in odd places like a tied roast. The head contained 1 bulging eye and 2 quivering circular red orifices underneath. One was pea-sized and widened as it sniffed the air. The other was larger and lined with small, sharp teeth. It walked in shaky, lurching movements as if unaccustomed to its own body. I felt almost sorry for whoever that had once been, until I saw it heave a red splash of bones onto the astroturf grass. It raised its head and let out a deep, barking noise, and then began pacing in twitchy, awkward steps. Feedback squealed from the speaker, sending it bounding out of view behind the houses to my right, before the stranger upstairs spoke again. I've been feeding them cadavers donated to science. I don't know how much you saw, but you need to trust me. Their bodies only seem to crave the proteins that they now lack in their current forms. I mostly believed him, but I would never cross a bridge that was only half completed. I slowly exited that first house on the left, observing the space, noting ladders mostly encased in cement cylinders at the far end of the street, and the one hatch on the left between the houses near me. The colossal space was beyond surreal, magnifying my fear with its attempt to simulate a pleasant town from the world above, filled with horrific monstrosities that ate on human flesh. The earworm melody from the elevator looped in my head as I clenched the knife tight and quietly walked to the next house on the left. I looked in the window to see a bloated human head smushing against the glass. It was as large as a pumpkin, with flesh stretched so much that only pulpy red tissue was visible in the holes that what was supposed to be a human face. It teetered back and forth, clearly unable to see. The body was giant and bulbous, with knobs of ropey varicose veins. I wasn't taking any chances going in there. It was alive, and I did not know what this thing was capable of. I continued to the third house on the left, nearly jumping out of my skin at a deep animalistic yell that seemed to come from my right. I rushed into the house and shut the door quietly, gripping the knob tightly as I looked out the window, not noticing any movements. I then heard a dragging sound from behind me that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I turned to see the manic, smiling, pretty face on a bald human head sliding on the floor towards me. Her wide, staring eyes looked straight at me above a normal nose and a toothy mouth shivering in spasm. Its body dragged behind a long tube of flesh lined with dozens of small, trudging legs resembling those of a human baby as it slowly emerged from the kitchen. I held out my knife and opened the door as quickly as possible. The thing's mouth stretched open as it charged at me, the skin on its face peeling back entirely from the mouth as a large muzzle of tooth-filled gums snapped forward. I barely slipped out of the front door, but those lunging claws banged against it so loudly that I saw peering eyes of varying size and distance from each other blink and swivel on cocked heads, alerted by the sound. The nightmarish earworm from the elevator looped frantically in my head, just as dozens of those monstrous things emerged from the shadows and came charging towards me. All I could do at this point was abandon stealth and just run. The screams alone were enough to drive me to the brink of madness as I sprinted down the rubber street of the hellish suburbia. I ran from the hideous monsters that scuttled, bounded, and lopped towards me from nearly every direction, even spilling out from the elevator doors. Dozens of them, massive bony jaws snapping, fat tongues flopping, and shiny white eyes all fixed on my flesh. I saw the hatch labeled A-13, just a couple of feet ahead on the left, between the houses. I glanced at the small crack under the hatch, seeing shadows moving, and I ran past it, unwilling to trust it. I twisted the weight of my shoulder at the last second to ram a slender form that came charging towards me screaming, crawling with dozens of stacked black talons that echoed all the way down its arm. Pain ignited across my bicep as I headed towards the congealing splatter of remains at the end of the street. Above it was a concrete cylinder which housed the steel rungs of a ladder. My feet slammed against the rubber road as I sprinted. I ran towards the feeding tube until I was tripped by something shiny and black in the shape of a rhinoceros beetle's horn. And then I began to fall forward as everything slowed to a crawl. I aimed my other foot far left to compensate, and by some miracle I did not end up on the ground, and continued my sprint towards the encased ladder. Puddles of blood splashed as I ran forward and jumped, gripping the slick steel rungs tightly to climb as fast as my body would allow. The ladder shaft reeked horribly from decades of rot. I felt a deformed, wide hand grab my ankle and yank me down violently, banging my jaw on a rung with a stunning blow. I quickly yanked myself back up and freed my foot from my boot, and the thing let out a high, gurgling scream as it fell. I heard the falling bodies clang against the metal rungs as they descended. I used the few seconds of breathing room I had to push the kitchen knife's blade all the way down between my foot and the inside of my remaining boot. The blade now extended through the heel as a makeshift weapon. Just as the horde of creatures returned, I felt long fingers wrap around my calf as I stomped violently down, releasing a squeal from the elongated fanged face of the thing below. There were dozens of the screaming things in that tube, with twice as many black orbs and gnashing jaws. I jammed the blade into a deformed head with a downward stomp and climbed faster and higher into the darkness of the tube. Some of the rungs were slippery with blood, and climbing in the darkness became increasingly difficult. I finally got to the top of the hatch from which the stranger had been feeding them, and my beating heart sank down into my stomach as I discovered that it was locked from the other side. The feedback squealed from the speakers, not from above, but just below me to the right, repelling the pursuing monstrosities away from me once more as the voice on the system continued. "You know I can't let you go after what you've seen. All of our work would be completely destroyed for nothing." There came another feedback squeal as the speaker cut out. The slobbering, howling sounds of the horde below entered the ladder well once more, echoing demented screams throughout the narrow space. I stepped down a few rungs to the source of the speaker sound, and reached over in the blackness, and felt a large, sliding grate that seemed to hold the source of the voice. There was one to my left as well. Neither of them had locks. I slid open the grate that led to the speaker and turned on my pocket LED flashlight, pointing it inwards towards the voice. There was a space big enough to crawl through. I realized the passage might lead to that blind madman on the speaker. I slid the left one open and climbed quickly inside, removing the steak knife from my boot and used it to lift and close the sliding vent cover behind me. I crawled away slowly and silently in the darkness as I heard scuttling behind me. I then heard a screaming coming from the speakers, I listened with a slight feeling of vengeance as the stranger wailed in agony as those things devoured him alive. I assumed they got to him from the adjacent vent. Once I traveled far enough that I felt that my light would not be seen, I powered my cell phone on and used it to illuminate the metal passage that seemed to go on forever. I saw the grate at the end of the ventilation shaft. I exhaled heavily and crawled a bit faster. I then listened intently. Phone screen turned off to make sure that I wasn't seen as I dropped down. I turned my phone back on and was startled by a large face in front of me. It was a massive painted portrait on the opposite wall. It was the familiar face of the man who had left me to die in that suburban shelter. He was far younger and was smiling as he held a test tube. Wood paneling and a groovy rug of swirled hues of blue decorated the space, filled with lava lamps and a stereo speaker and a turntable. His office looked more like a swingers lounge than a workplace. I spotted the light switch and flicked it on. There was even more paintings of topless women that lined the walls. From the looks of it, his office had been untouched for the past 40 years. I shuffled through some papers on his desk, reading a bit before switching off the lights and opening the one wooden door as quietly as possible. I then heard saliva-filled heavy breathing in the dim hallway that the door led into. There was only one small guy light in the hall ahead of me. Glowing orange rings trailed down a line of elevators. Hope flooded back into my heart as I saw a sign labeled Ground Exit. All I had to do was get by that shadowy shape, scuttling low to the ground with far too many limbs. It was spider-like. 2 sets of back legs and 2 sets of arms, elbows, and knees, all pointed upward as it scampered around rapidly in the hall. The head shivered and twitched, sending a chill up my spine. An open elevator shaft on the left answered my unspoken question as to how it got up here. I silently headed back to search the office of Mr. Gabe Reverton, the name on the metal plate on the kidney-shaped desk. I scanned the room, noticing a standing flag of orange and brown hues, with the ARC logo printed on it. It was only then that I realized how much I was bleeding. I ripped the ARC flag from its brass pole, slashing it with scissors from the desk to make bandages for my stinging arms and legs. I stared back nervously at the trail of blood leading to the open vent, and realized that time could be short if those things followed my bloody trail. I picked up the brass flagpole, slapping the heavy metal against my hand, gauging its stopping power. I then searched through memos and emergency protocols on the desk, reading through elevator reprogramming procedures in case of a lockdown. There were Polaroid photos of small, horrifying things, similar to what I saw in the hall. I then stumbled upon a finances sheet and read through it quickly. I was amazed at the $500,000 cost of the most basic anti-radiation package offered. This had been a multi-billion-dollar facility, with top scientists of the era, as well as clientele from around the world. I put together a folder of the most fascinating papers, including maps that I found that detailed the entire facility. I then heard a growling from the open vent. I realized that I would be in even more danger if I stayed another second. I shoved all the paperwork in my pants against my back, and tried to mentally prepare myself as I gripped the flagpole in my hands. I took in a few deep breaths, and slowly opened the door. The creature scuttled over in thumping steps. I ran and jammed the flagpole into the thing's fleshy side, shoving it into the open elevator shaft as it squealed a horrific sound. I then ran to the exit hatch and climbed the ladder, despite the burning in my muscles. I then heard a squealing behind me as the giant spider approached rapidly. As it was nearly upon me, I reached the top. I shoved with all my might, expecting it to be locked. But by some miracle, it wasn't. With one quick motion, I sprung out of the exit well and slammed the door shut. The moment I did, a loud bang rattled against the metal frame. The moonlight nearly blinded me as I laid down in the dirt and leaves. I eventually gathered myself and covered the exit hatch as best I could, with surrounding small rocks and dirt. I gazed with teary eyes at the moonlit trees and the autumn leaves, taking in the scene before beginning my long trek back to my car, listening to the peaceful sounds of the night as the crickets chirped all around me. I was trying my best to think about the warm bath and the soft bed that awaited me. I was trying my best not to think about what I had read on the paperwork or the horrors that still lurked beneath me. I was trying my best to keep my mind off the joint founders, Gabe, Barbara, and Calvin, and their 3 other facilities.